Ruslan.
Where would you say sexual purity plays into this conversation? There's been a non-Christian movement. This whole like no FAP thing has kind of like, you know, and I think there's probably some overlap with men's improvement, RP, right? No FAP. I think there's some stuff going on there. So how do you then approach sexual purity, right? As I think the scriptures are fairly clear, right? Like, you know, nothing outside of a one man one woman marriage is God's heart for us. How do you guys approach those conversations? How do you navigate that? And what is your prescription to men? Maybe that even aren't followers of Jesus.
Yeah. So to me, this so many layers to that one. The first thing is that, you know, there's this thing, and in 1 Corinthians, I believe chapter 5, where Paul, was it 5 or 6 when they're going? There's both of the chapters are talking about sexual morality. Mm-hmm. But there's this thing in 1 Corinthians within one of those two chapters where Paul makes a claim where he says, no, this is not for those who are not of the church.
Yeah, I want to chapter 5. Yeah, you're spot on. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and he says, "Hey, my last letter I told you, don't associate with people who are sexually immoral. I did not mean the people that are in the world, because well, then you wouldn't be able to affiliate with anybody. I was specifically talking about the people in the church." Right.
100%.
So that whole chapter is about like expel the wicked Christian from among you, because there's a dude sleeping around with his father's wife, and it was Church of Corinth was wild, bro. That's a wild church.
It was a modern era before the modern era ever existed.
Yeah, 100%. So I think that's a great point. But go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah. So to me, going back to that verse, I find it challenging to demand religious behavior from non-religious people. And it gets kind of wild, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's layers to it. And so for me, I tell people what I believe in. You know, I believe what God says. Am I the best liver of what God says? I gotta acknowledge that I'm not. You know, I think the blessing of life is that, you know, men like you and a lot of my other friends got married young. Mm-hmm. You know, and so with regards to sexual purity conversation, I mean, it's one thing to talk about it when you're 22, 23, you get married. Not a whole conversation when you're 35. And you're so single, you know, and so it's layers to the conversation. The rules are always the rules. Let's not deny. I'm not trying to say because you're 35, you don't got to follow the rules. No, the rules are the rules, but there's layers. It's one thing to struggle with purity for like 2-3 years of adulthood versus 20 years of adulthood, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's layers to the conversation. But then going back to, I just struggle with telling non-Christian people you have to follow the Christian rules. So I share with them what the world says, what God says, what I believe, and what everybody else believes. So I share everything. I never recommend, you know, sinning. I just share hey, this is what you're gonna do. This is what you're gonna do. You're not a believer, you don't believe in God. I'm not gonna inspire my religious beliefs to you. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, I think the hardest part is creating the religious morality to the non-religious people, which the majority of our audience are not Christians. And so, and by God's grace, there is a lot of people who are. And so a lot of people who are understand that perspective, and they understand that what we believe in. You know, I shared it in my video where I talked about the truth about being a virgin, about, you know, virginities seen as weakness when it's not. I talked about it in my Big Brother series when the last video was titled Sex is Not an Accomplishment. And so I've definitely talked about it. But like I said, it's a challenge when a majority of people are not religious and you're telling them to follow religious rules, especially older male adults living in this modern era. It's really crazy if you really get into the layers of it.
Wow, that's an interesting thing. It's an interesting line to walk. You guys have a predominantly non-Christian audience. You guys are Christian and hold to a Christian sex ethic, it sounds like, which is, you know, hey, one man, one woman in the covenant of a marriage. That's what sex is reserved for. That's where you can experience the blessing of it. It just makes me think of so many of these modern errors are kind of mitigated by applying God's ways to our times, right? Like applying the ways of God to our times. So I hear you on that. I think you're spot on. I mean, scripturally, clearly, 1 Corinthians chapter 5 backs up your point. And I also don't want to be so shallow. It's just like, Well, bro, just preach the gospel to them. Just tell them about it, you know, because yes, that's it. But it's also, we both know that sometimes it's a process for people, right? So it's like you guys sharing your testimony is amazing. You guys leveraging your platform as being Christians in culture, I think is powerful, man. So kudos to you guys for doing that. Do you see the gospel as the ultimate solution to a lot of these issues? I mean, I guess, and I don't mean to oversimplify, right? But I read some of these comments, and these guys just have this like, you don't understand how women are. I'm like, man, my homies are getting married right now at 21, 22, 23, 24, crushing it, making six figures, newlyweds, you know what I'm saying? And building lives together. So like, yes, for me, I'm 13 years married, I'm removed, respect. But help me think through some of that.
No problem. So I think the very first thing is that I have to kind of share my story to understand it. Because I think in regards to your original question where you said, you know, is the gospel the only hope, right? And obviously the answer is that, but then what does that look like? Mm-hmm. So shout out my Uncle Show. You guys know him by his name, Misho Baraka, but Uncle Show always,
that's your real uncle?
Always, huh?
That's your real uncle, or you just say?
No, I call him my uncle because
the hottie. Like, that's crazy if Show Baraka is your uncle.
Yeah, but no, the hottie out of Blueprint in Atlanta, like he's like kind of like my spiritual father who doesn't love me. And Uncle Show is my he's always been my uncle. So we've been together for so many years. I call him my uncle nowadays. But Uncle Show would always say, you know, he said you can either, there's two ways of making art. You can make art about the light or make art about what the light has shown you. Right. So if the light is Christ, it's like you can make art about Christ where you can, you know, do a song about the theological Shailin type songs. Right. Mm-hmm. Or you can make us art about what the light has shown you. Like I would think a great song of that is like Kendrick Lamar's Swimming Pools. Mm-hmm. Like he's talking about the despair and the depravity of just over drinking, you know, and that's what the light has shown him. Like God has made that clear. Like that's not good for him. And so to me, I think the gospel is the universal solution to humanity. Yes, is the gospel, but also the temporal solution to humanity today. If it's not so, the gospel and explicit JPMs is what the light has shown us, right? So like, what has Christ showed us about politics? What has God shown me about science? What has God shown me about psychology? The redemptive nature of the Christian thinking into those sciences and places, I believe that's also the solution to society.
Kingstream Entertainment, Ruslan.
When the culture says do what you love, we respond with love what you do. You may have responsibilities that you aren't passionate about, but loving what you do means being faithful to what's in front of you, committing to excellence as if that were your greatest dream. Colossians 3:23 says, work diligently at whatever you do, as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people.
Love what you do. Love what you do.
Kingstream Entertainment, Ruslan.
Yo, thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. If you found it valuable, considering giving it a like and subscribing. This month, I'm releasing the Love What You Do collection. And to celebrate, I'm doing a 3-day virtual event to help us go from learning to love what we do to ultimately doing what we love. By the way, it's free, so hit the link in the description to grab your seat today.